much, John. So I want to start by thanking Stuart for inviting me to this event and apologizing for the fact that I'm wearing my coats because I'm freezing in here. I really, really enjoyed listening to John, and I'm just very happy to be here. It's a delight. So I guess the first thing that I want to say is how much I agree with so many of the policy recommendations that John talked about at the end of his talk. I think an awful lot of that stuff is absolutely ripe for reform and would be a great idea. And really, a lot of the problems in doing that have nothing to do with the free market system, capitalism, etc., but in the political process here in Australia, how to actually start the conversation with politicians about these issues. And the fact that he talked about so many of those kinds of programs and tax breaks and systems that we have here in order to try to fund the UBI should give you a clue that the UBI is very expensive. And he didn't go into any specific details about prices, but if we're thinking about truly a universal basic income to every adult man and woman in Australia, by the latest ABS census figures, that would mean we're talking about paying money to about 18 or 20 million people-ish. And at the moment, we spend something like roughly $180 billion on our social programs like, New Start Allowance and the pension scheme and other kinds of social programs that would presumably be at least partially overwritten by UBI. So I'm trying to give a sense of the scale of expenditure here, right? Now, to give people a basic income that is actually worth anything, that is actually going to help them to feel secure, to provide those kind of security benefits that John is speaking of, it needs to be more than a couple $1,000s a year, right? So mostly when I've heard the UBI spoken about, it's been spoken about in terms of around $10,000 to $30,000 per person per year. So if we take a figure of like $20,000 per person, just as a round figure, then you'd be talking about a total cost and a total expenditure of about $380 billion per year. Now that's compared to what we're currently spending on those programs of 180-ish. So that's a significant increase in our expenditure on just a fraction of what the government would then presumably be providing to people, right? If John's saying we would use this as a base and then we would build from there. So that is the core of the argument against the universal basic income in Australia, is the amount of money that we're talking about. It's way, way outside of what we're currently spending, and for that reason, politically, is pretty much dead on arrival. That's just the reality. So it's not like I'm saying that's a bad thing, a good thing, or any other thing. I try not to take an ideological position about it. But realistically speaking, it's dead on arrival politically. What you can do, however, and I think this is where there's a much bigger chance to actually improve outcomes for struggling people in Australia, is to identify those groups that are struggling and whom we are not serving well. And I think John is absolutely right to be thinking about the Indigenous communities in rural Australia. I think that is where we have the worst outcomes, socially, health-wise, economically, and everything else. And a lot of those people never really move very far from their current locations. And so what we have there is an opportunity, because of geographical circumstance in Australia, to isolate particular regions of Australia where we say, you know what, that area really needs some cash assistance now. Let's pilot a scheme of helping these people in a way that is not requiring them to interact with our tax and transfer systems at the moment, because it's that interaction which causes them not to get the access to the money and to the support that they need. Right? They are not able, because of cultural differences, linguistic problems, and other access problems, to actually obtain the assistance that the Australian government, like many other countries, developed nations around the world, provides through its tax and redistribution schemes. So I think that would actually be a potentially viable thing that one could make a go of in terms of political will. So I think that that's a good idea, and there may be other kinds of areas in which we want to reform what we're doing to try to help vulnerable groups. And then, of course, at the moment, I also want to just point out Australia's scheme, tax and transfer scheme, essentially attempts to provide what in hypothetically would be a universal basic sustenance for every person who needs it in Australia. And so in that sense, like many developed countries, we have a progressive system. We are not paying Gina Rinehart $20,000 a year to do nothing, right? We pay her a lot more than that to do that, exactly. But she earns it, supposedly earns it, right? But the government doesn't literally write her a check. Now, I know exactly what you're saying about making money in ways that are not what you and I might consider to be worthy ways, right? Absolutely. And I have a book to recommend to you in a minute about that. But in terms of this scheme, if we were to implement a true UBI, then she too would be getting this money. So just to talk a little bit about what's done in other countries, because John mentioned this, there is definitely a bifurcation between developed country schemes and developing country schemes. In the developing world, the best evaluated programs that I've seen have run in places like India and Kenya, and there are other places as well. And there are great outcomes that you get in those countries. Now, remember, in these countries, it doesn't actually cost too much to pay everybody something that actually means something in terms of purchasing power. And so when you say to people, everybody in a particular village, I don't care what you're doing, whether you're employed, unemployed, single, married, whatever, you're getting this amount of money. Those people are living in such a way, right, at such a raw cliff edge of survival in terms of themselves and their children, that you're going to get a big bang for the buck there. So you see big improvements in children's nutrition, in outcomes for women, in entrepreneurship, in all sorts of things that socially we would just want to see, right? And economically we'd want to see. But that's in the developing country context. And I do disagree with John that it's wrong to say that that's not relevant to Australia. I think it's highly irrelevant to Australia in terms of the outcomes that you'd be getting. We're not going to get a big impact in terms of children's height for age or weight for height in Australia, but you will in India from a universal basic income. And it's going to be much, much more expensive here, and we are a developed country. Now, what's happened in the developed countries that have done this? Well, they haven't really trialed universal basic income, and that's the little sleight of hand that's often, slipped into these debates. Universal basic income means universal. Everybody gets it. It doesn't matter who you are, right? But in fact, these countries that have trialed it have put a little box around people who are already receiving welfare, already on unemployment benefits, already basically low income in some way, struggling in some way, and they've said, okay, look, for this period of time, we're going to try just paying you a fixed amount rather than making you interact with the tax and transfer scheme and fill out applications and have a graduated schedule of benefits based on who you are and blah, 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 which is what we do now, right? So you really can't compare. You can't say that's a universal basic income trial. It's not a universal basic income trial. It's a trial of supporting people at the lowest end of society at a given moment using flat fee handouts rather than having them interact with the system, okay? So for the longer run, it's not the same thing as paying every single person in a country a particular amount of money, okay? Now, we are seeing increasing trials of that kind of idea. So how can we better manage the people who are struggling in our society? And that's where I think we should be focusing our efforts in Australia if we want to actually pursue something like this, which is what I said at the beginning, right? So targeting communities or sections of our population who are really struggling. In addition to the Indigenous rural population, I think there are a couple of others that would come up to my mind. Certainly one person came up to me in advance of this talk and said, do you call yourself a feminist? Do you know there are pro-feminist arguments in favor of a UBI? Well, so one of the arguments that I've heard, and John also kind of gave some reference to this, is that women who are in marriages which may not share the money equally and who are not themselves in the labor market or don't have as much economic power as the man may find themselves disadvantaged and unable to participate fully in life because they don't have economic independence. If we're worried about that as a society, then we can restructure the tax and transfer programs that we have to better target those people with what they need. Same thing with abused wives, for example, or children who maybe in families which are dysfunctional. There are ways you can target those people so that in fact we get a progressive policy. Because at the moment on paper, UBI would be a regressive policy. You'd be taking money from the people who are the neediest in our society, who are currently getting benefits above the level of the UBI, whatever it would be, and you're reducing their payments and you're giving it to people like Gina Rinehart. To me, that sounds regressive. That does not sound like what I would want to do, right? So I think there are ways to tinker at the moment, and I don't mean tinker as in for face and not actually making a difference. Target particular sections of the population and say we need to better support these people, in addition to the Indigenous rural and the women as well. There is also the issue of our young people. So a lot of our young people today have a lot of trouble breaking into the economy. They have trouble, getting housing. They have trouble getting a job. They have trouble getting access to TAFE, et cetera, et cetera. I think we could do a whole lot better for those people. And certainly the idea of providing money to a person on their 21st birthday as a kind of insurance plan for their 20s, look, I'm thinking about doing that for my son who's just turned 18 yesterday. So, I don't think there's really anything blocking that. And again, age is not something that you can get away from. Everybody turns 21 at some point, right? And for most of us in our 20s, we were, kind of eating hand to mouth, right? Because it was like not easy because you don't have much to go on when you're that age unless your parents are loaded. So I think that kind of thing might be able to be trialed as well. So I think that's basically all I wanted to say, other than if people in the room here are really interested in other ways in which we could try to reform the system to try to get more political traction on issues that are important, I would highly recommend to you this lovely book called Game of Mates, How Favors Bleed the Nation. It's written by a frequent co-author of mine, Paul Freiders, and Cameron Murray, who is a Queensland economist. And it basically has a chapter on each of a number of Australian industries and how people at the very top of society in those industries have managed to create an elite network in which they piss into each other's pockets and defraud the rest of us. So it's a very, very entertaining read. So thank you very much.